Hey everyone, it's Horror Free For All, and I hope you're doing well today. I'm finally ready to bring you my top 10 Monsters episodes. Now, this series was a long trek for me. I kind of hit burnout after binging Tales from the Dark Side and Tales from the Crypt, but here we are, and it's better late than never. I thought that this show overall was a fun experience, even though I took my time with it. And I have to say, this might be my most hot take I have, I guess, within the horror anthology subrealm, in that I think Monsters as a show is actually better than Tales from the Dark Side. Now, before you hang up your pitchforks and want to spear me through the heart with that statement, I think that this show, often than not, was far more brutal than Dark Side ever got. And to be honest, I think the top 10 episodes here, for the most part, are consistently better than most of anything Tales from the Dark Side had to offer. Which is saying a lot because Tales from the Dark Side actually had a higher score average, but I would find myself wanting to watch these episodes more than a good amount of my favorite Tales from the Dark Side episodes. And that might be case specific for me, but that's just how I feel. I feel like Laurel Productions, the company that was founded by George Romero when he wanted to make a creep show spin-off television series that spawned Tales from the Dark Side and Monsters, finally hit a stride in what they were good at in this show. I thought Tales from the Dark Side was a weird hodgepodge of Twilight Zone and wanting to be like that, and also wanting to be kind of like Creepshow. And I don't know if that was CBS's in part doing in messing around with the tone of the show and maybe ordering less than serious stuff in those first couple of seasons. But I think in the long run, it really did hamper the legacy of Tales from the Dark Side, which only really got great, in my opinion, consistently around season 4. And I thought Monsters was surprisingly super fun for the majority of it. Now, there are some duds in the bunch, but we're not going to talk about those. We're going to talk about the best. Now, there are some fan favorites I'm probably omitting in my list, and I totally get if you're frustrated with me not putting them on here. But before we get into mine, let me know down in the comment section, what are your favorite Monsters episodes? With that being out the way, here's a montage of some honorable mentions. Now that you got to experience that, we're now going to look at my favorite honorable mention. And I'd be remiss not to mention my favorite honorable mention here because it scored the same score as basically my number 10 through 6. And from the regret that I feel from my Tales from the Dark Side top 10 video, not including my favorite honorable mention there, I want to include it here as well, like I did in my Tales from the Crypt ranking. And my favorite episode that's not in my top 10 goes to episode 33, Reaper. Now, Reaper was a story written by Robert Bloch, and I gave this a 4.25 out of 5 stars. It was actually based on Bloch's story that first appeared in the Cutting Edge anthology from 1985. This story revolves around a cantankerous old man, as a few reviewers on YouTube has called it, and I like using that term, so I'm going to use it here as well. He is pretty much sick and dying in this elderly person's home. And he knows that death is calling on his doorstep, but he doesn't want to go yet. So when he meets death face to face one fateful day, he tries to make a bargain with death. And the bargain is, if he can replace himself with somebody else in the home, he gets to take the remaining time span that they had left to go. And this in turn will keep him in a cycle of hanging around. And it comes to a point in the story where he realizes that every suspecting victim that he starts to take might have just as much as expired time as he has. And he grows more desperate in trying to find more people to get rid of. And it comes to a point in the story where he perhaps has the tables turned on him and somebody else is now targeting him. And we see that culminate in the end of the story. What I think works in this tale and why I put it as my strongest honorable mention, I know that this is a popular episode for the writing, and I will have to say that the writing is probably the best part about it. It tells a story about knowing when your time is up and trying to hang on to things that possibly won't do you any good anyway, because the end is always going to be inevitable, and you can only cheat it so many times. What I like about this message is that resonates really well. It's the same message and why I like the Final Destination movies at the end of the day. It's a very simple tale, nothing too rich in subtext. It's just really well done and well told, well performed, and it's iconic to me. But not as iconic as my top 10. My number 10 is actually an episode that I raised up in score once I finished the whole show. As we'll see with another episode, in case you watch my ranking videos, there were 2 episodes on this list that I bumped up in score retroactively. And my number 10 slot was one of them. We have episode 8, Sleeping Dragon. Now, this story was written for the show by Michael Reeves, and I gave this a 4.25 out of 5 stars. This story is quite simple. You have a researcher, an attractive woman, and an elderly gentleman that are in a bunker facility out somewhere in the Arctic, I presume. And there is a artifact found in the nearby area that they have brought inside the bunker, and it looks to be very ancient. And what appears to be a spacecraft or some sort of intelligence craft of some like, they start prodding and poking around it, and some otherworldly things start happening. And once this thing, whatever's inside, breaks out of it, and unleashes a creature feature bloodfest, kind of, in the wake. And what these researchers have come to realize is that this creature inside, perhaps, is a alien ancestor of ours that goes back millions of years, that once inhabited Earth, and perhaps were as intelligent as humans. And perhaps this intelligence can be communicated through without a language barrier. And it results in the end of the story of them having to put possibly one of the greatest discoveries in science of all time to rest. Now, what I like about this story is that it's unapologetically a creature feature nonetheless. There's a great movie quality to this episode that you can't really replicate in the show, but other episodes really do kind of echo the quality here. I love the monster design on the sentient dinosaur creature. I thought that he was really creepy, and the shots that the director decided to use in this episode featuring it were, in my opinion, well done. I think this concept would have worked great as a creature feature film in the early 90s. As much as I love dinosaur flicks like Carnosaur and Jurassic Park, this would have been a unique spin on it, and I think given the right production company and the right audience, this would have found a niche in the market that people would have gravitated to. Now, when it comes to what the story is saying, it's very simple. The greatest discovery in science, possibly ever, is perhaps humanity's greatest foe. And putting a discovery aside in order of survival is kind of thought-provoking in its own right. As yes, this can make the researchers very rich, possibly, or very famous. But at the end of the day, what is that worth if you're not alive to reap those benefits? And that's why this story resonates with me so well. Moving on to number 9 now. We have episode 42, The Offering. Now, this story was written by Dan Simmons, and I gave this a 4.25 out of 5 stars. This was based on a Simmons story that he wrote in an anthology called Night Visions 5 from 1988. It had a different name, and I can't remember what it was, but it had a similar premise. And because I think Simmons liked this new version that he wrote for the show, he included it in another anthology later on called Prayers to Broken Stones in 1990. Now, The Offering is a tale that I was not expecting to like as much as I did, but I really enjoyed the emotions to it and the creature feature effects. It's about this guy who has an injury on the way to the hospital to visit his dying mother. And it turns out the doctors have given a prognosis that she's dying from some sort of cancer. And the man has this head injury that perhaps requires him to have this drug placed inside of him to do CT scans and further testing. And when he wakes up from the testing, he decides to go see his mother, who's in the same hospital. But to his horror, he sees that there's a creature on top of her, injecting her with some sort of fleshy tumor. And this petrifies the man, and when he tries to piece together what's happening, he realizes that perhaps the chemicals that he's been given is allowing him to see this creature that nobody else can see. And it's up to him to make a sacrifice to poison whatever the creature is putting inside of his mother, to not only save his mother and kill all the tumors being put inside her, but whoever else that might have cancer in this hospital or throughout the world. Now, this story, I think, is commentating on the perceptions of the sick and dying, and perhaps the limitations of medical field knowledge. There's a embrace of the supernatural and the paranormal in this story, mixed with a medical laden drama, that I thought was very intriguing. You have this interdimensional being injecting a woman with cancer tumors, and you have this man who seemingly has the only ability to see what is actually happening, and he's given the ultimate task to save people who are being targeted by these creatures. It's a harrowing tale, and I think what makes it work even more is that the man is trying to save his own mother. And what he goes through in the story takes a lot of backbone and acumen to pull off. And for that, I weirdly love it. Now, the reason why I hold it back is because of some loose logic involving some of the medical procedures mentioned in the story. It doesn't make much sense when you really think about it, but if you give yourself to the disbelief, you'll enjoy it enough. And that's why it's in my top 10. Moving on to my number 8. Now, this one is possibly my biggest hot take in my entire list. And I know nobody else appreciates this episode as much as me, but I weirdly love it. For it being a silly, tongue-in-cheek, corny episode that Laurel Productions finally got right, in my opinion. We have episode 39, Mr. Schaber.
Hi.
This story was based on an idea by Stephen L. Nelson, who I think also wrote it and submitted it to get adapted into the show. I gave this a 4.25 out of 5 stars. This story is super simple. I think you have a young boy named Roy who has a terrible family. He has a single mom and an older sister that basically boss him around and force him to do chores around the house to make their lives easier. And all Roy likes to do is play with his model train kit in his basement where he's kind of secluded to. Unfortunately for Roy, one fateful day, he meets this creature that's a prize inside of his cereal, who is named Schaber. Now, Schaber at first seems to be a horrific entity for this young boy as he comes to life when he touches water. But as the story goes along, and as Roy gets to know Mr. Schaber, he realizes that he's actually made a real friend and possibly a new member of the family. And this culminates in the story where the mom and the sister come down to bully Roy into listening to them and following their orders. But Roy uses the help of his newfound friend to take care of them and get some much needed vengeance. Now, this story has basically no commentary going for it. It's all in the performances, it's all in the subtext, and it's all in the presentation. I myself am a massive kids horror fan. As you can see, I have Goosebumps stuff on my backdrop here. I have more Goosebumps knockoff stuff from the 90s over here. I love kids horror. And this, to me, is before the golden age of that time. It's before the shows like Are You Afraid of the Dark and the book series like Goosebumps ever came out. And you can see the roots of both of those in this episode. And I really love it for that. I think that the actor who plays Mr. Schaber does a fun performance. I like the idea of a cereal prize becoming a monster. It's a cool, unique spin on a kids' horror monster tale. And I think Michael Oliveri's performance as Roy was really good for a child acting performance in this show. Now, what holds it back, of course, is some dated late 80s, early 90s gaff humor. And yeah, it can be really, really corny and tongue-in-cheek at times. But I also think that it gives off this weird vibe that the late 80s and early 90s were exuding in media. And it kind of fits this niche that I'm looking for. And that is this like pseudo John Waters, Bob Balaban niche. Ironically enough, Bob Balaban actually provided a story that you'll see later on this list, but I digress. At number 7, we're now getting into the episodes that I think for the most part people are always on board with being on top 10 lists. We have the final episode of the entire show, and it's the only one in the show written by the prolific author that birthed Creepshow from 1982 that consequentially resulted in monsters getting made to begin with. It's episode 72, The Moving Thing. Moving Finger is based on a story written by Stephen King, and I gave this a 4.25 out of 5 stars as well. You can actually find this story that was released first in the December 1990 issue of Fantasy and Science Fiction, and it would go on to later be printed in Stephen King's famous short story collection, Nightmares and Dreamscapes. This story is quite simple, and there's not a lot to it, but it's just glorious and kind of depraved in a very unique way. You have an older gentleman who's played by Tom Noonan, who actually was a writer for this show and wrote a handful of episodes. He plays an old man that might not be all there in mental health because he spends a lot of time at home in hermitry, but one day he starts to hear this pestering noise that gets under his skin, and he looks around for the noise and can't find the source until he goes into his bathroom and looks inside of the sink and sees that there is a elongated human-like finger appendage protruding out of it. Knowing that what he's seeing might be psyche devolving, he tries to make sense of it and perhaps mentions it to other people in passing of what he's experiencing. But he quickly realizes that nobody's going to believe him, and the only way to solve this is if he does some more investigating himself and tries to get rid of it. And by getting rid of it, he takes up an arsenal of weaponry to try to kill it. And what results is some over-the-top, violent depiction of a man trying to defile an appendage. And what results is an over-the-top climax, an end result where an unsuspecting person gets roped into the mix. So the moving finger, in my opinion, perhaps is the thing that prods in the back of your mind that kind of drives you crazy. And I think what's ingenious, and I think I understand why Stephen King had a finger to be the monster of the story, is that when you feel annoyed by something, let's say like a tapping noise, or perhaps a noise that you just can't get rid of in the back of your brain, or maybe a memory or thought, it almost feels like somebody's tapping on your brain with their own finger. And I don't know if that was the reason why he chose this, but I think it makes sense at the grand scheme of things. And I think that the story is a huge metaphor on that idea, as the main character sees a finger poking out of this drain. Perhaps he was annoyed that he couldn't fix the sink early on, and the finger is a manifestation in his mind of that idea that's always looming in the back of his head. Who knows? I mean, it's never explained, but it's a good way to look at it. And what we see in the episode is a manifestation of the crazy. Now, what happens to the cop at the end could also be an inflection on maybe sometimes the crazy can have some legitimacy behind the origins. Who knows? But it's over the top, and I guess it works to kind of send that schlock punch home. And I weirdly love it. But also, at the same time, what holds it back is some lack of context here, kind of gapping the logic hurdles here. But nonetheless, a really fun episode and worthy of my top 10. Now at my number 6, we have a very popular episode that I also agree with the fandom is amazing. We have episode 51, Bug House. Now, Bug House is based on a story written by Lisa Tuttle that was first released in June of 1980 in Fantasy and Science Fiction. I also gave this story a 4.25 out of 5 stars, like all the other ones below it, but I gave this one the highest distinction of this rating of this show. And for the reason of it being the most played straight horror story in the entire show. The story revolves around a woman who has an estranged sister, and she's reluctantly visiting her because of car trouble and needs a place to stay until she can get her car fixed. While at her sister's house, she realizes that her sister is pregnant and there's a boyfriend in the mix. And while she's never met the boyfriend, she can't help but notice this strange power that this man has over her sister and grows a little concerned. To the point where she tries to snoop around in business that she probably shouldn't be snooping, and the sister takes it as possibly the sister is just trying to steal her boyfriend or do things that she used to do and why they aren't close anymore. Well, there comes to a point in the story where the sister's boyfriend comes on to the woman and they perhaps have an affair. And after this affair, feeling the guilt that she feels, knowing that her sister is pregnant and going to give birth any day. She wants to tell the sister perhaps what has happened and possibly wants to get out of the situation. But the boyfriend might have another motive with involving that, and there's a massive plot twist at the end, perhaps insinuating that the boyfriend isn't all who he says he is. And through a horrifying realization, the woman finds out exactly what's going to become of her sister and possibly herself. Now, this story, I think, is a pseudo-commentary about the treatment of women in relationships, specifically how they're squashed and walked over like bugs from men. And I can see that message through and through in the story, and having them give birth to bugs. Perhaps there's a certain message involving what the sister gives birth to also lends credence that this is a cyclic thing going on and it's hereditary within men. I couldn't tell you, but given the subtext, yeah, I can kind of see that. At the end of the day, I just think that this story is very horrifying and has some of the best body horror to date that I've seen in horror anthology shows. Given its budget, though, I do think that what holds it back is the narrative structure. I do feel like it can jump from point to point in the episode rather suddenly, and I also feel because this was in season 3 and the budget was noticeably starting to get lower and lower as the seasons went on, there's some editing effects here that they look like they cut corners on. Now, I couldn't tell you if that was due to the ratings board or whatever stepping in, but it's there. But nonetheless, I think that this story is very great, and this is one that I constantly find myself wanting to rewatch from the show. Now entering my top 5, these are my absolute 5 favorite episodes from this show. We have now graduated from the 4.25 out of 5 rating, and we're now entering the 4.5 out of 5 star or higher rating for the remainder of the list. And at number 5, we have episode 54, The Hole.
He's alive! He's trying to get back!
This story was written by Jerry Conway and Wayne Berwick, and I have to say, this one took me aback. I never thought that there would be a story in this show that would be a full-on commentary about war. I mean, the closest thing before that was maybe Where's the Rest of Me from season 1. And that episode kind of had an idea to roll with that might be in some aspects more memorable than this episode. But what sticks out to me here is the attention to detail, the claustrophobic setting, and honestly the performances and the writing. It's about these 3 soldiers. You have a South Vietnamese ally soldier to 2 American soldiers who happen to be Caucasian and African American. And they all have ventured down into this hole to escape this napalm or destruction going on above them. And being in the hole, which is thought to be controlled by enemy patrol, is better than being out in the elements. But quickly, these 3 men find themselves isolated, and there's no Vietnamese enemies down here in the bunker, except for one dying soldier who has horrific lacerations and bodily mutilations going on. And the interpreter of the South Vietnamese soldier hears the story of the man and realizes that there are the dead that are haunting the walls inside the tunnel, and they are essentially stuck in this death trap. Knowing that there's going to be death above and death inside, there's really no safe place to hide. So the soldiers try to make do with the situation they're given, and they treat it like the dead are just mindless soldiers that their enemies are anyways. And they think that they have control in the situation, and they split up. But that ends up being the wrongdoing, and we see in a horrific fashion what ends up happening to these gentlemen. Now, in my opinion, I think that this episode really does commentate on the thoughts of war being pointless. And I know this was a popular sentiment given many works that I've read in my lifetime about the Vietnamese War and how Americans perceive the war in general. And this perhaps is an inflection of how the soldiers possibly were feeling down in the tunnel. They don't want to be fighting this war. They also don't want to be hiding in enemy territory, but they also have been programmed by the government to treat whatever's in front of them as an obstacle and to get rid of said obstacle. And perhaps that has blinded them from realizing what they're experiencing. And as the audience, you get to hear what the characters are talking about in the dialogue of the story, and you realize that they all miss home. They don't want to be in this war. And the dead that are haunting the walls here, they don't want innocent bloodshed to happen either. And they're just trying to stop war at the end of the day, because it doesn't matter which side dies. If they cease to fight, it's over. And that, to me, is a much more powerful punch than people generally give this episode credit for. Now, what holds it back, I think, is kind of how monotonous it is to get to the fun parts in the climax. But I will say that the character dialogue and the performances were fine enough, and this one is another endlessly revisitable episode for me. Now, my number 4 slot, I actually bumped up in score. This is the second episode, like Sleeping Dragon, that I bumped up retroactively once I finished the show. Because ever since I watched this episode, I can't really get it out of my mind, and I know I flat out love it. We have episode 29, Love Hurts.
All I can do on a card.
This episode was written by Edith Swenson, and I gave this a 4.5 out of 5 stars as well. So this story is very Tales from the Crypt-like. It's almost the most like Tales from the Crypt episode I've seen outside of Tales from the Crypt. It's about a woman who perhaps deals in the voodoo arts. She's into a man who is married and perhaps is going to be into a lot of money if his wife gets eliminated out of the picture. And once she hears this information, she tells her boyfriend, who's a sleazy husband in his alter life, that something needs to be done about the wife so they can get the money. But what he doesn't know is that she's using magic to help facilitate this to happen. And she wants it a specific way to not have the husband go back on his word and, possibly stay with her. And while the husband's wife gets an inkling of what's going on in the relationship, the hindsight issue for this woman using voodoo magic is that she doesn't take into account that the wife might know what's going on. And once the climax of the story happens, there is a massive plot twist involving the husband in particular, and a specific ritual that the voodoo woman has done to ensure that this connection is, kept consistent. And we see in horrifying fashion by the end of the episode of what that entails. Now, what sticks out to me about this episode is that it executes the ideal moral that Tales from the Crypt often went for in that show, but sometimes missed the mark on. I think that this one executes that sentiment better than your average Tales from the Crypt episode. You have a true comeuppance tale here. You have a piece of shit who is cheating on his wife with a woman who is also a piece of shit. And through them being as scummy as they can be, they brew up this toxicity that, just wants to breed karmic justice in the situation. And what's delivered more poignantly than I give it credit for historically, and why I have bumped it up recently, is the inclusion of the wife in the story. As I think on it, I think the wife inclusion really does help send home the comeuppance that we feel here. And to be honest, I don't know. This one is delightfully horrific. It has some good character drama going on. It has one of the more riveting stories. It kept me on the edge of my toes more than the others. And yeah, I think this is an exceptional episode. Held back by, not having a little more substance there, but, you have your typical themes of adultery here, and, you shouldn't do that. So I like it for that, even though it's not the most creative thing ever. Now, my top 3 have been my top 3 since I formulated the list originally. I've never moved these around. They just literally landed here as I watched them. And at number 3, I think we have an episode that people historically have not given a lot of credit to. And that is episode 30, The Farmer's Daughter.
And you can go first.
Now, The Farmer's Daughter was based on a story by Bob Balaban and Kenneth Pressman, and I gave this a 4.5 out of 5 stars like the other two I previously mentioned. But what I think sets this one above the others is that it also feels like a Tales from the Crypt segment done right. But I think this one also takes a creative approach on a very famous story from Tales from the Crypt called The Death of Some Salesman, and humanizes the characters a little more, and I think makes a more enthralling idea of a traveling salesman story, in my opinion. So this one is simple. It's about a traveling salesman who turns out to be selling, religious Bibles, gets stuck in a storm out in a rural part of the country. And this kind couple has allowed him to stay at their house to, brave the night elements, and so he can have a fresh night's sleep and be able to leave in the morning. However, the only other bedroom they have for him to sleep in involves a daughter that they have, and he's going to have to basically bunk with her. And for him being religious, he's going to have to figure out a way to separate them in bed because, he doesn't want to, get into sin, let's say. But as the story goes along, and he meets this beautiful daughter of these two older people, he starts to realize that there might be a romantic connection there, and he can't control his impulses for how beautiful she is, and he perhaps wants to indulge in them. But as he indulges in them, he sees the horrific side of what he's done, and perhaps the sin that he has feared has tainted the woman that he has bestowed himself on. As the climax will imply, he's not the only guy that has had this trouble with this woman, and there's perhaps a tragic story involving her and a horrific thing to become of this man. And I'll leave it there. So what makes this story resonate to me is the acting performances and the setting. And honestly, I think the makeup effects here were at their all-time best of Monsters, if I have to say. What they were able to do with the farmer's daughter character was really cool, in my opinion. And very eerie, and I like how it crescendos as the story evolves. And I think what makes this concept really work is how it ties to the subtext of the story. When we're looking at the idea of sin and, acting on lust before you're married and all that plays a role in the story to what happens to the farmer's daughter and the backstory even given that. And perhaps what's happened to her is a damnation from hell, and perhaps what's happening to the man is a punishment for giving into that from the Almighty above. And it makes you think on, religion and the afterlife and some aspects to it, which you probably wouldn't think on the surface going into the episode, but it really works in that way. And there's some fun humor here at the chagrin of the main character, who is touted as this religious person, but at the end of the day is tempted by sin like everybody else, and makes it weirdly relatable and makes you think that nobody's perfect in this world, even as devout or as holier than thou that you proclaim yourself to be. And that's why I really love this story. It's only held back, in my opinion, by how rushed the climax is and perhaps the small scale feel to it. I possibly would have wanted a more expansive thing out of the story. Maybe have more rooms in the house divulged into, and maybe some more backstory on some previous gentlemen in this farmer's daughter's life. But nonetheless, a very exceptional episode. Now, my number 2 is actually a very famous story from this show, and none of you are going to be surprised that it's on here. We have episode 23, Mannequins of Horror. Now, Mannequins of Horror is a story written by Robert Bloch, and I gave it a 4.5 out of 5 stars like the others. But what I think sticks out in my mind is that this, I think, is the only time in Monsters where this episode was technically a remake of an already semi-known horror segment. Originally, you can find this original interpretation of this Robert Bloch story segment in a film called Asylum from 1972. And I'll play a clip so you can see what that looked like. Now, the origins of this story goes back as far as December of 1939 in an issue of Weird Tales when the story first released. And to me, this screams pulp fiction in all the best ways possible, and also why pulp horror is some of the best horror ever made. This story follows a man who is essentially rotting away in a mental asylum. And he spends his days as a person that used to study anatomy and be in the health profession, building these clay figurines with realistic organs inside of their bodies. And he claims that in doing so, he's actually creating life. And the doctors kind of write him off and say that he's crazy, But as the story goes along, these health professionals observe this man and some odd phenomenon going on within the asylum. And it turns out that maybe this connection of life that this gentleman is saying isn't necessarily how he described it. As we see towards the climax of the story, these mannequins are perhaps animated and going after people who have wronged this man and have treated him horribly. One of the healthcare professionals ends up having an interaction with one of these clay figurines and does something horrific to it, which in turns does something to the creator himself. And I'll just leave it at that. But yeah, this story was really shocking to me. And for this being a remake of early 1970s anthology horror segment, I thought that this clearly surpassed that in what they were able to do there. Now, I don't know why this one hits higher, but I think they had the spirit of the story in mind here, and they probably already knew what that segment was like and thought that they can remake it and do it justice. And I'm glad that the show took the time to remake this one. And yeah, I think the story has a good message to it about the treatment of patients, even in places like insane asylums. And perhaps it's an inflection on, you know, kind of listening to what people have to say and not putting disbelief at the forefront of everything. Sometimes seeing is believing, right? And that message hits hard in this story for a lot of these healthcare professionals who are trained to be scientific in their approach, and they don't necessarily understand the supernatural because that's been trained in their profession to be written out of the equation. But similarly to other stories that we've already covered, like The Offering, for example, that message is kind of here as well. And I think it's also awesomely executed as it was there. So that's why it hits a little bit higher for me here, because of the extra mile they went here with the gore and the creativity. I will say it is held back by a few slow moments and a few dated things. But other than that, it's a solid runner-up. But my number one Monsters episode, in my opinion, is one of the best horror anthology episodes ever made. And I knew the moment I saw this episode, there was no way any other episode would ever top it in the show. It's episode 18, The Match Game. Now, this episode was written by Christopher Orville, and I gave this a 4.75 out of 5 stars, which is the only episode in the entire show I gave that high of a rating. Now, I almost wanted to put it at a perfect, but I can't quite put it there for some small drawbacks, and I think it's because of the ridiculous setup that it has going for it. There are some logic hurdles that you can kind of overlook, and it does pick a lane with it, but how the inciting incident happens in the story is completely random. But other than that, I think this story not only has the best cast, the most memorable premise, and the most graphic depiction of violence I've seen in the show, but it's just so good, and it's endlessly rewatchable. I've seen this episode now 10 times, and it's the one that I find myself wanting to watch the most. Listen to this list and see if you recognize these late 80s and early 90s icons. I think his name is Sasha, I want to say Henderson or Peterson, but I'm probably butchering that. I know his first name is Sasha. He was in Halloween 4, The Return of Michael Myers. He was also in Richard Linklater's Dazed and Confused. We have Ashley Lawrence from the Hellraiser franchise, and you have Tori Spelling from Beverly Hills 90210. And then some relatively unknown guy who kind of plays the main character, but he's so good that I've actively tried to find more things that he's in. I forget his name, but yeah, he's really good. Now, what I love about this story is that it takes the drive-in schlock era of the 1970s and an idea ripe out of that. As a matter of fact, I think that this story takes a lot from a very, I guess, infamous movie now, I guess. I think it starred Robert Carradine or whatever his name was, David Carradine, I forget his name. It's called The House of Seven Corpses. And in that story, it's about an animated corpse that comes and essentially terrorizes a group of people staying inside of this home that was once his dwelling. It's no different here in the Match Game, but except you have 4 teenagers playing a cool little game inside of the home. And on this fateful night that they decided to play this game, they all light matches and they go around in a circle telling a story, and they have until the match goes out or until they can't bear the heat anymore and blow it out to continue the story. And then the next person will go on and continue it. And as they go around the circle, it ends up to this guy who happens to be really into Ashley Lawrence's character in the beginning of the story, he gets into this trance and starts saying very specific things that the other teenagers are kind of mystified by. And as he's saying these things, we see as the audience, there is a corpse coming out of the lake on the property and is now walking up to the house, and these kids are going to be in danger. And we see, in a pretty graphic fashion, one of them get their neck snapped and another one get brutally attacked. And then the two surviving teenagers, in a classic slasher fashion, have to figure out how to put this ungodly monster to rest and in the situation. This one to me is just bona fide Atomic Age comics, and it exemplifies everything I love in that subgenre. Atomic Age horror was about scaring the shit out of kids first and foremost, but it was also coming to talk about certain things without talking about it out front, and they would hide those messages behind schlock and over-the-top gratuitous violence. Here, the story is about the exploitation of the dead, and using an urban legend in this case, or maybe a popular story, or a story that you think is absolutely fictitious and might doubt, can have its ramifications. Because at the end of the day, the villain of the story, who ends up being this swamp monster, perhaps is a forgotten soul that people think is not worthy of remembering in a good way. And because he has some people in his home, he's now used this ability in this game that they're playing as a figurative seance of sorts to animate himself and get revenge on the people who have drug his name through the dirt. And perhaps some of the stuff mentioned in the story is true about his character, but perhaps some of it is exacerbated. And I think the moral grayness to the villain coming alive in the story kind of makes you root against and for him. Because you can understand both sides, in my opinion. Now, what I think sends this episode over the edge and probably higher than I guess some people would give it, at least for me, is the performances, it's the tone, and it executes horror in some of the best ways possible. And in my opinion, it just makes it the absolute best Monsters episode. So with that being said, like I said earlier on in the video, I had a blast with this series. There's so many other episodes that I gave less than a 4-star rating that I didn't put in the honorable mention montage, but I know some of you might be wanting to include that down in the comment section of this video, and I totally get why these would be your favorites. Sorry if I left some out, but these to me are the ones that I find myself wanting to watch, or rewatch, I guess, in this show. And Monsters is a bit different than a Tales from the Dark Side or Tales from the Crypt for me. As much fun as I had watching these, I think these 11 that I specifically talked about in this video are the ones that I find myself actively wanting to rewatch the most, and I took that into more account than I did in previous shows where I pretty much enjoyed myself watching it all the way through, like Tales from the Crypt, for example. But similarly to Tales from the Dark Side, I think that this show is criminally underrated in some aspects to it, and I think a lot of people sleep on some great stories in here, and you really should go check them out if you haven't before. So yeah, that's my thoughts on my top 10 Monsters episodes. Until next time, take care.